think we're ready to start.
Okay, thank you very much, Becky. Good evening. Welcome to the Alliance Manchester Business School's annual Grigor McClelland lecture, in which Diane Coyle is going to talk about Is a Business to Blame for Capitalism? In particular, how current business practices are encouraging short-termism, ignoring nature and harming consumers. So we're looking forward to this very much. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we start. First of all, everyone's been muted, so if we will invite you to speak. If you pose a question later on in the Q&A, we will ask you to say your question. The event has been recorded and it's been live streamed on Facebook, so the world can hear what Diane has to say as well. It's great. Questions should be posed in the chat function. If you're not familiar with Zoom, the chat function is more or less in the center of the screen at the bottom of the control panel. So just click on that, and then at the side panel, you can pose a question. As I said, I will ask people to pose questions directly. So I will just say your name and please give your question. If you're not able to do that, I will facilitate the question myself. Okay, firstly, I would like to invite the director of our school, Professor Fiona Devine, to say a few words of introduction to the lecture before we get started. Thank you very much, and over to you, Fiona.
Okay, so thank you very much, Bruce. And I am unmuted, I presume.
Yep.
Yep, good. So welcome everyone to this annual lecture commemorating the school's founding director, Professor Grigor McClelland. Now, this lecture was introduced in 2015, and that was the year of our 50th anniversary as a business school. And we decided to introduce the lecture in honor of the school's founding director, Professor Grigor McClelland. Now, the event each year explores the interaction between business and management education and social responsibility, areas that Professor McClelland pioneered throughout his career, and which the University of Manchester and Alliance Manchester Business School are pioneering right now. Now, a Quaker, a businessman, an academic, a government advisor, a philanthropist, and an author, Grigor was a strong advocate of the principle that business cannot be divorced from society and that managers should be ethical and socially responsible. He was a man with a clear moral purpose who brought compassion and a concern for social justice to all that he did, including his own impactful research and inspirational leadership style. He always took an innovative approach to business and management education, also which became known as the Manchester methods in the early days of the business school. And the key feature of the approach was always to emphasize learning by doing, which is something that many business schools do today, and indeed remains pivotal to our own approach to teaching and learning within the school. I'm really delighted, as has been the case in the past, that members of Grigor's family are here this evening and have joined us, and want to extend a very warm welcome to Faze, Stephen, Bushra, Camille, and Anissa McClelland for joining us online. I'm so very glad that you feel that you do want to join us every year at these lectures. And of course, last year, many of you'll remember we had a lecture from Martin Wolf, Associate Editor and Chief Economics Editor of the Financial Times, who got us all thinking very deeply about the world's superpowers, notably the US and China, and relations between them. And we all went away and, as I say, did a lot of thinking, as I'm sure we will be doing today. So this year, I'm really delighted to welcome this evening's speaker, Professor Diane Coyle. Diane is currently Bennett Professor of Public Policy at the University of Cambridge. She co-directs the Bennett Institute, where she heads research under the themes of progress and productivity, and has been an advisor on economic policy to government through many years, including the current COVID-19 pandemic. Her latest book, Market, States and People, Economics for Public Policy, examines how societies reach decisions about the use and allocation of economic resources, which, as you can imagine, is hugely topical. And Diane, as many of you will know, is a prolific writer, and her next book, Cogs and Monsters, What Economics Is and What It Should Be is due out in hardback from Princeton later this year. And I'm sure that it will be another must-buy book. Now, originally from Bury in Greater Manchester, Diane was previously Professor of Economics here at the University of Manchester between 2014 and 2018. She was awarded a CBE for her contribution to the public understanding of economics in the 2018 New Year's Honours List. She played an absolutely pivotal role in bringing the £32 million UKRI-funded Productivity Institute to be headquartered at Alliance Manchester Business School and now sits on its leadership team. The Institute is going to support and has started already to support a step change in the quality and quantity of research available in the UK, which will very much inform government policies, but also businesses, helping businesses with their strategies to improve productivity. Now, as you'll have got a sense of just a moment ago, Diane has also served in many public service roles, including as Vice Chair of the BBC Trust, member of the Competition Commission, and also member of the Migration Advisory Committee and the Natural Capital Committee. Now, this evening, Diane will discuss whether business is to blame for capitalism, what a title, and whether current business practices are encouraging short-termism, ignoring nature, and harming customers. Now, when I talked to Diane many months ago about this evening's lecture, we discussed how there is widespread concern about the way in which business operates and a sense that capitalism needs to change, and a sense that that may also prevail even more strongly as we hopefully move out of the global pandemic situation. I'm very much looking forward to Diane's thoughts during the lecture on how businesses, policymakers, governments, academics, and many other stakeholders can shape the kind of market society we want post-pandemic. So today we get the chance to hear Diane's thoughts on these very huge and topical issues. Now, the lecture, as we've heard, will be followed by an audience question and answer session, which is going to be facilitated by my colleague, Bruce Tether, who's a Professor of Innovation Management in AMBS. Now, Bruce has a keen interest in design. Design is about thinking how things, including products, services, and systems, might be better. So I think it would be fair to say this evening we are thinking about how things could be better. And on that note, without further ado, can I pass over to you, Diane, and thank you very much for agreeing to give this lecture this evening.
Well, thank you very much, Fiona, for that kind introduction, and also for the honour of being invited to give this lecture this evening. While I'm using this snazzy new Zoom function to get my slides up on screen, and could I ask Fiona, will you shout out if you can see them and still hear me?
I can indeed, yeah.
Until Tuesday evening, the plan was that I would be in Manchester.
Diane, we've just lost you.
Just lost your sound for a moment there, Diane.
Is my sound back?
Yes.
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 I don't know what happened there, sorry about that. It was tempting fate to say that I had been hoping to do this as an in-person event and a hybrid event in Manchester, but events intervened. But I hope at least you've all got the chance to sit at home with a nice cup of tea and relax while I present what is obviously a deliberately provocative title. And it's also, in fact, obviously a rhetorical question, because business is capitalism. It's business that fundamentally drives market economies. So I'm going to try to answer that question, but I'm also going to talk about the solution and what business's role might be in coming to a solution. And as Fiona said in her introduction, in building something better as we emerge out of the pandemic. And the lens I'm going to use in this is, you wouldn't be surprised to hear, productivity, given my role as one of the theme leaders in the Productivity Institute. But also I'll be drawing on other work that we're doing at the Bennett Institute in Cambridge, thinking about well-being, so broader measures than productivity, and thinking about the debate about beyond GDP and how do we know whether our societies are getting better or not. So let me dive into it. There's a lot of talk these days about a crisis of capitalism. There's a crisis of capitalism every time there's a crisis in the economy, of course. I can remember the late 1970s, the oil price shocks, and the sense of a crisis of the whole system that was around then. There was another in the late 1990s with protests against globalization and the World Trade Organization, the famous battle for Seattle. We had the Occupy movement after the financial crisis. But now, as you can see from this slide, there are lots of quite establishment figures, Forbes magazine, for example, BBC, the FT, talking about the crisis of capitalism. It's in the newspapers, on the media every day, and it's not a purely anti-establishment phenomenon this time around. And so the question is, why do we have this sense of crisis? Is it just the pandemic, or is there more to it than that? And I want to suggest that there's a lot more to it than that. And that actually what we're experiencing now is a continuation of a sense of malaise in our market economies that has continued since the financial crisis and the post-crisis recession. But why now? Why all these headlines? Well, one thing I want to try and suggest, and actually I'm almost putting on Marxist spectacles here and talking about class struggle, is that part of it is about the returns to labour. Here I've got a chart showing you the share of labour and the share of profits outside the financial sector in GDP over the post-war period. And you can see that there's been a decline in the share going to labour. When I was a student in the 1970s, it was received wisdom that these shares were pretty much constant, almost as if they were structural features of the economy. But it was around that time that the labour share started a quite significant decline. It picked up a little bit and then dipped again post-financial crisis. That tick that you see at the end, right up at the end, is about the way that furlough income is being measured, whereas business profits aren't going up. And so one of the bits of the explanation might be that actually capitalism isn't making people better off the way it used to. And actually, we can look at other evidence pointing to that as well. One is about average earnings. And this is quite an impressive chart about capitalism. It goes back to 1800. It's from the fantastic Bank of England Millennium of Data database on the UK economy. And you can see that there's a very impressive, steady, almost steady increase in real average earnings in the UK over that very long period, since the dawn of capitalism, really, since the start of the Industrial Revolution. And that is the story of capitalism. It's the way businesses innovate. Will Baumol, the late American economist, refers to the free market innovation machine. And it's businesses that do that, that search for new technologies to turn into new products and services that make people's lives better over time. And that in turn translate into the things that we really care about: life expectancy, better health, greater ease of living. And anybody who grew up like me in the 1970s, who thinks back, will be aware of the things that we have now that are innovation driven, that we didn't have in the past. So growth isn't a story of material gain, really, of more cars or more pairs of shoes. It's about those innovations that make our lives better. But also it's reflected in this increase in workers' incomes. And you can see from the chart that this has slowed down in every recession, and particularly in the early 80s. But that steady increase, and particularly in the post-war era, is really quite impressive. But let me extend that same chart forward. The same data, I've just added to the end what's happened to real average earnings since the financial crisis. And I've labeled the other slowdowns so that you can compare them: the 1970s oil crises, Thatcherism, and the recession that came about with deindustrialization. But nothing like what's happened to real earnings since the financial crisis. And in fact, there's now been about 10 years of decline, much steeper than previous slowdowns, and a decade that's been really an assault on people's living standards. And this isn't about homelessness or people who need food banks, although those numbers have gone up recently, but it's a broader sense that it's become impossible for most people to get on to make the kinds of gains that we've come to expect. And that contract between generations, that parents would expect their kids and their grandkids to be better off than them, that's what seems to have broken down. And so, in a way, the fundamental social contract of capitalism has been broken for the past 10 years. And that seems to be a difference between this crisis and the previous crises that I talked about a little while ago. At the same time, there's been an explosion of top pay. And what I've shown you here is a table from the High Pay Center. It shows you the ratio of chief executive to median employee pay in the top companies, 10 top companies. The average CEO pay, £900 an hour, that's a good 100 times median earnings. And the focus here is really on ordinary businesses who are part of this, but even for ordinary businesses with much lower ratios than these extraordinary ones picked out in this table, these kinds of ratios would have been unthinkable until the early 1980s. And so if we do have well-paid chief executives sitting in the audience, one of the things I say to you is that you're not worth it. There has been an upward arms race, a kind of upward ratchet in top pay. And I think there's some quite persuasive evidence that this has driven the short-term focus. That you see people on the boards of companies who have incentive plans that drive them to increase the share price over the short term. And that's the focus of what they do. So I'm a middle-aged lady economist. I'm not a particularly radical person. I think capitalism is a good thing. And so this is a serious problem in my eyes. These kinds of ratios of the rich, and these aren't even the super rich, but these kinds of ratios to what ordinary people can earn would have been outside any acceptable social norms. In that period, in the post-war years, the 1950s, 60s, and up to the mid-70s, when capitalism was delivering broad-based increases in living standards. So the question is, what is it that is driving these kinds of shifts? And having pointed to top pay, for me, that isn't the underlying issue. The underlying issue is about productivity. And this is a chart I use a lot. It's a chart that motivates a lot of the work that we're doing in the Productivity Institute. And what it's showing you is in black figures for the United Kingdom, in red for the rest of the G7 top economies, currently meeting in Cornwall, of course. These are output per hour. That's labour productivity. And the solid lines are what's actually happened. And the dashed lines are a continuation of the trend prior to the financial crisis. And you can see two things. This chart is telling two stories. One is that there is a gap between the UK and the rest of the G7. And up until the financial crisis, that gap was narrowing, but it now seems to be widening again. And the other point is, of course, the puzzle part of this is why there has been a slowdown, particularly in the UK, but across all the advanced economies since a little bit before the financial crisis. So these are the figures that the Productivity Institute is trying to explain and to remedy. And the reason for that is that productivity is what fundamentally drives real earnings. And so my next chart shows you that over time, and this time it's going back to the 1970s, labour productivity sort of rises, real earnings sort of rise in line with labour productivity. There's been some drift as well. Real earnings haven't kept up as well with productivity in recent times as they did in the past. But the productivity growth is a necessary condition. Without that, then you're not going to get those gains in living standards, those improvements in the quality of life, in life expectancy and health, that are what this is all fundamentally about. Now, productivity, people often think of this as being worker effort. Could you work harder in the hours that you put into your work? And that's the sort of intuitive response many people have to the phrase labour productivity. It's actually much more to do with business. This is all about you if you're in business. And so the amount that gets invested by businesses, the way that businesses organize their production and how they sell things, the way that businesses use knowledge inside the companies and pick up innovative ideas, the research they do. All of these business activities are what drives labor productivity fundamentally. Workers matter, and particularly the skills of workers, but the key thing is about business. And if you think about the productivity puzzle and the gap, it's a little bit like an Agatha Christie mystery. There are many possible culprits, and probably all of them are guilty in the end. These are quite familiar lists, and a lot of them were in the government's plan for growth that was published around budget time. So skills, improving worker skills, investing more in infrastructure, access to finance, and a whole familiar list of things that we talk about when we talk about what's happening in the UK economy and its problems. But what I want to single out this evening to get to my provocation is bigness. And there's a lot of it around. The image is Apple's HQ, and it's just a fantastic visualization of what a big company is all about. And we attach this adjective big to all kinds of sectors of the economy: big tech, big oil, big banks, big pharma. I'll come to the last one in a minute. And when people talk about big business, they're not usually meaning it in a flattering way. It's not usually a term of praise. We think about big tech being a problem, partly because they are so big, they are so powerful, we depend on them entirely. And there are a lot of digital harms that seem to come along with that, whether it's conspiracy theories online, polarization of political views, loss of privacy. Do we know what's happening when we're being sold advertising? Are we addicted to technology? Are these companies just too powerful? So there's a whole set of issues around big tech. If you think about big oil, it's whether they are doing enough and fast enough to address the problems of climate change, in large part caused by our use of hydrocarbons that they produce and sell. And you'll be aware that Shell has lost in a Dutch court a case brought against it, requiring it to speed up its transition towards contributing to net zero targets. Big banks, we think of the financial crisis immediately, and the way that the concentration and the interconnections and the speculation of big banks on their own accounts created the most extraordinary fragility in our financial system. And at the time, I saw the charts of interest rates at which banks lend to each other overnight, which used to be printed in the FT, rising so sharply that they went off the edge of the chart. And I thought, well, if they don't trust each other with their money overnight, I don't trust them with my money either. And I took out a whole bunch of cash. A bit later, it's stuck in between books in my bookshelves, and occasionally a £10 note falls out, which is rather nice. But the most sobering moment then was the Bank of England minutes published much later, when they said they thought we were a few hours away at most from not being able to pay for things in the supermarket because the payment system was going to go down. And all of the shortages and panic buying that might have prompted. Now, if we think of big pharma, we should love pharma this year, given what they've achieved for us with the vaccines. But even with pharma, there are questions about whether or not society gets a fair return from taxpayer-funded investment in research and discovery when pharma companies are highly profitable and in both non-market and market healthcare systems charge very large amounts for the drugs that they discover. Big food, you might be wondering, that's perhaps a novel phrase, but I was very struck by a report that Nestlé had commissioned into its own products recently and concluded that about 2/3 of them were unhealthy. The food industry has been processing our food more and more, adding different types of fats, salt and sugar, contributing to the obesity and ill health epidemic. Obesity is a comorbidity factor for all the COVID-19 illnesses and deaths. And I think food, the food processing industry and big food might well be in for a tobacco moment. and we'll see whether that comes or not. But the point is that there is this sense in this litany of what's wrong with big business, a really underlying sense of unease with what the market economy has been doing to us. I want to focus in on one particular aspect of bigness that interests me as an economist who has looked over many years, including 8 years on the Competition Commission, at competition. And across the OECD, as this chart is showing you, there's been more bigness in the sense that markets are getting more concentrated and competition is decreasing. These two charts, left-hand panel for Europe, right-hand panel for North America, show what share of the change in the share of sales that's going to the top 8 companies in each sector. And these are for industry. It's the same story if you look at services. A bigger increase in concentration in North America, but in both cases, rising concentration of many markets in the economy, and a challenge for competition policy. Now, there are underlying economies of scale in many businesses. It's particularly true in digital, and there not only is there a big advantage to scale. If you've invested in the software and the data gathering, you want to sell to the whole world, and that's what they try to do. But there are also network effects that make them winner-take-all markets, because we all like it the more other people are using these digital services. And that delivers great value for consumers. Consumers love these digital services. They get great products from many companies. And competition policy has focused on certain aspects of that, particularly prices, and not worried too much if there are not major price increases. We've been in a period of low inflation, and so perhaps the competition authorities haven't been particularly bothered about increasing concentration. But on the other hand, there's a cost to this as well over time, and that is the lack of incentive that companies have to innovate if they do have such a strong position in the market. And so there's a trade-off between those short-term advantages of scale and the long-term benefits of innovation. And as I said right at the start, it's innovation that's really been driving those long-term gains in living standards. So you might say competition authorities need to buck up their act, and certainly there's been a lot of debate in competition policy circles about digital markets, and that's changing quite significantly around the world now, including in China, which hasn't historically had much competition policy. But it's also, I think, about the political philosophy of the Thatcher and post-Thatcher era, that there has been a presumption that the private sector, the market, is what's going to deliver these improvements in living standards over time, increased productivity, increased prosperity, and not enough attention on all the other things that are needed for that to happen. But I think that public philosophy, if you like, is changing now. And it's not just because of the way governments have had to step into the economy so much since the pandemic. I think it predates that. And one thing that's clearly changing is the public concern about climate change. One of the top 2 or 3 issues for the public in many countries whose opinion polling I've been looking at. These are the kids in Cambridge on one of the climate change Fridays, climate strike Fridays. I think this is not just about the pandemic, it's about a broader sense and a broader generational change, that the free market in a way is a myth. And what we're talking about is what are the best kinds of collective arrangements for delivering increasing prosperity, about what we want to do, how do we want to allocate resources, and how do we want to allocate rewards to those resources. Now, smart businesses are going to be ready for this, and some already are, particularly on climate. Financial markets are really sitting up and paying attention to what's happening with climate change. This is a lovely illustration from a paper by my colleague Matthew Agrawala and his co-authors, just published, looking at the change in sovereign bond ratings when you take due account of climate risk from the climate modelling. So it brings climate science together with what the ratings agencies do. And there are very few green parts of that map. if you adjust sovereign bond ratings for climate risk, then we should be downgrading, in some cases by quite a large amount, the sovereign bonds of these different countries. We need to do this for corporate bonds as well. That's next. And this isn't just about what the financial markets care about. This is about business risk. It's about what are your profits going to be and what's your productivity going to be. Now, some shareholders are really onto this, and here are a couple of recent examples. The Astrazeneca shareholders, after all that they have done in delivering the vaccine this year, the Oxford vaccine, have suffered an investor pay rebellion. There have been a record number of shareholder votes against executive pay. The mood music on that is really changing substantially. And the second example on this slide is engine number one, a small hedge fund, an activist, climate activist hedge fund, which has forced Exxon to accept two of its nominees for its board. So Exxon, like Shell, is going to have to speed up its thinking about addressing climate change and how it changes its business. So there are shareholder demands that are making businesses change their thinking on this. There are also employees, and anybody who works with young people will be well aware that there's a significant generational change going on. Young people have a different view. They are not satisfied with the status quo, particularly on climate, but also on a range of other social issues and other corporate social responsibility issues. So there are those two pressures. But it's also about the bottom line, about the risks to businesses' profits in the future if they don't take corporate responsibility and ESG standards seriously. For example, a loss of biodiversity that our Cambridge colleague Partha Dasgupta has a fantastic report about is going to affect agricultural productivity. My region now, the east of England, the breadbasket of the country. And that's going to affect food banks. That's going to affect food businesses. The existence of food banks and homelessness is going to affect consumer sentiment, but also consumer demand. The number of people you would normally previously have considered standard middle class or working class families who are using food banks now is simply extraordinary. If there's no consumer demand there, we're not going to recover from the pandemic, and anybody selling consumer goods is going to be affected by that. So it's time for businesses to take ESG seriously, and a lot of people are indeed taking this on board. So I've got an example here of how the World Economic Forum, speaking for the elite of businesses, is thinking about it. And it's a slightly provocative title to the slide because it's quite hard to disagree with these broad sentiments that they express here about good governance of businesses and accountability, about sustainability for the planet and its natural resources, about human dignity and potential, and about ensuring that innovation delivers true progress widely to many people. So it has these four pillars, and who could really disagree with those? So apologies for the slightly cynical title here, but they're also quite bland. So we need to think about what that means in practice. They need to be translated into how businesses should be acting on them. Now, the good news is that for the first time in a long time, the public thinks businesses are the people who can act on this. This is a diagram from the latest Edelman Trust Barometer, which is always a fascinating read. And they have located the different institutions they poll about, government, business, non-governmental organizations, and the media, on these two axes. Are they ethical or unethical? Are they incompetent or competent? And in 2020, none of these institutions got into the ethical and competent quadrant. And the government fared worse. Business was seen as competent but somewhat unethical. NGOs, on the other hand, seen as ethical but somewhat incompetent. So the good news is that in the polling that Edelman did for 2021, business moved up into that Goldilocks top right-hand quadrant. Business is now seen as the most competent and the most ethical, and able to deliver, perhaps, on the ESG standards that we now all want to see. So that's the good news about it, and there's a responsibility that goes with that. But I'm a little bit concerned about the ESG frenzy that's underway at the moment. And no doubt many people in business are just somewhat confused about exactly what it is they should be measuring and doing. And so I'm showing here a slide that is the way that we think about it in our wealth economy program. And it's not a list of metrics which tend to multiply and which are all somewhat different and can lead businesses into feeling that they've got to tick the boxes without quite knowing how those metrics relate to their underlying business strategy and profitability. We think about it instead as an extension of your balance sheet in a business, that you've got a financial balance sheet, but you've also got a balance sheet with all of these other assets over which you will have some control. And so they're labeled here. Natural capital is the services that we get from nature. Human capital, the health and the skills of the workforce in a business or the population of the country. Knowledge capital, what you know, how you do things, how businesses operate internally at the business level. The physical capital, the businesses and homes and infrastructure. Social capital, the norms that bind us together, the norms that have been stretched by the gap between executive pay and the pay of the rest. And that applies at the community level as well. And then the institutional capital, which is about governance. Who is responsible? How are they held accountable? What are the systems of governance that we have in place? All of these might seem quite fuzzy concepts, and they are, like many concepts in social science, but they do have a lasting effect. They are things that you can accumulate over time, and they bring great benefits over time, and they're there as a reserve if you need them. And so businesses should be thinking about these kinds of assets as their whole balance sheet, and any ESG metrics that are adopted need to sit within this kind of framework, because this is how you think about strategically what a business is going to do. Because although we might agree that corporate responsibility, ESG, is motherhood and apple pie, we all want to see this. We all want a better future. We all want to build forward, as we call it, rather than building back. There are some really big decisions, some really big societal issues coming up. And here are just a few of them. What's the future shape of markets going to be? I talked a little while ago about the concentration in many markets, and particularly in digital, these winner-take-all markets, where you need the market to be contestable. The next Google to come along with a better technology, having innovated, and to kick Google out of the #1 slot the way it did the same to Yahoo some years ago. And that means that competition policy will actually become much more strategic, because it's really hard to foretell the future. And in a way, what you're doing with that kind of policy is shaping markets rather than taking them as a given and making sure there's a level playing field. These are, my phone is going, this is one of the Zoom moments, sorry. These are the kinds of issues that haven't been very prominent in thinking about competition policy and industrial strategy for over a generation now. And those are quite big calls. We're going to have to think about what are the right bets for the UK or any other country to place? What's the right balance between access to information and strategic choices for businesses? Then there's a question about are we talking about nation state interests, or are we talking about corporate interests? Because in the era of globalization, there's a mismatch between these boundaries. We've had a policy where state aid has been very stringent about governments not subsidizing national businesses to have national champions. But on the other hand, we've had a period where a lot of business has been offshored, and we might be concerned about whether that is going to return benefits to the home country, to the domestic consumers. And post-pandemic, we've started to worry about supply chain resilience as well. And that's a set of interests that compete with perhaps with the profit interests of multinational corporations. And then there's a question about, are we going to benefit current voters, or are we going to think about future generations? And that's a pretty acute question when you're thinking about investments that need to be made for sustainability. We've had too little investment across the OECD in general, but in the UK in particular for a very long time in infrastructure and in business. And that means in the aggregate, we're going to be seeing consumption sacrificed for the sake of future generations for sustainability. And similarly, some choices to make about pensioner interests versus worker interests. These are not decisions that businesses should be making. These are genuinely political decisions, and they need that kind of legitimacy. And so I want to end with that kind of thought. These are very powerful men. They're all men, of course, and they've got power of different kinds. Mark Zuckerberg has great power over how we spend our time, over small businesses' access to markets, over political debate. And we would like him to exercise that power responsibly. But on the other hand, there are decisions that Facebook is taking that we might properly want governments to be taking. Pascal Soriot is another powerful businessman, and he has been in, as everybody knows, in political dispute with the European Union about how the vaccines have been allocated. In a time of crisis or in any other circumstance in which supply chain resilience becomes an issue, then there is, if you like, a confrontation between business decisions and political decisions. These other two, in their different ways, have very great power over many things that affect businesses as well as all of our lives. In China, the Communist Party exercises that power without democratic restraint. In the UK, of course, we are a democracy, but we've got a very powerful executive, a hollowed out civil service, and a weak parliament. And so in all of these major decisions that are coming up for our societies, I think there are some really big questions now about the legitimacy of the system, the market system, the way it interacts with the public sector, and who is taking the decisions about what's going to happen in future. So to get back to my original provocative question, is business to blame for capitalism? Well, there are some really serious and challenging questions coming up for boards. And at the same time, some very encouraging signs that the need to change is being taken seriously. And I welcome that debate. But I want to end with the thought that we can't think about the private and the public as separate spheres. We need to shape a version of a productive market economy in which businesses and governments work together and work out better ways of making the decisions that deliver us that long-term sustainability, environmental, social, governance sustainability. So that's it from me. I hope I've given people food for thought over their cups of tea, and I will stop sharing my screen now so that we can have some time for questions and comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Diane. Very, very interesting, very provocative, hopefully, and I'm sure we've already got some questions coming in. I'll get to those in a second. I think I'll just start by abusing my privilege as the chair. I mean, one might argue you're asking an awful lot of business, because we're kind of expecting the productivity to keep on growing in a pretty linear way, like an escalator, more or less forever, raising real wages, which arguably is becoming increasingly difficult because many of the big wins for innovation, Robert Gordon's got an interesting thing on this, have been achieved, like jet engines. Jet travel doesn't go any faster than it did 40, 50 years ago. And yet we're also loading all these additional aspects on it. So to some extent, don't we have to compromise, maybe expect a little less on raising real wages and a bit more on some of these other things we want in terms of environmental sustainability development goals, perhaps?
So it's a great and very broad question to start with. There are two schools of thought about this. You mentioned Bob Gordon, and so there's a school of thought that we are running out of innovations and this is as good as it's going to be. And there's another school of thought, which is that there are lots of new technologies, perhaps not yet commercialized, that need a lot of other investments to bring them to fruition, that are going to change people's lives just as radically as the early 20th century innovations did. And I'm in that latter school. So you might think about things like green energy technologies. And if they are commercially available and become affordable and spread through the energy system, then that will be as radical a change as the internal combustion engine. That's a big win. Similarly, there are lots of biomedical innovations which can make people's lives healthier, reduce the pain that they live with, and improve the quality of their life enormously. There are questions about who's going to do the investment, what are the business models that will turn them into mass market products. All of those things need to happen. So to me, it points to just rethinking what we mean by productivity and real wages. And it's just quite hard to measure those qualitative step changes in big technologies in real wages. We're not very good at capturing that. So I would argue for perhaps thinking about productivity in a different way as we go on. So you might think about time saving, or the quality, the well-being that people get from the way they spend their time is a different way of thinking about productivity. You'd measure that a different way. That's a slightly rambling answer to your question, but I'm still optimistic that we can see progress, and we can see sustainable progress.
Excellent, thank you. It's always good to be optimistic. Let me see if I can handle this, the chat. I know some people have got hands up. If you could try and post your questions in the chat, because I can't see everybody, so it can be a bit confusing. We do have some questions here. Is that right? Yeah. So there's a question from Andrew Serban Lakota. If you want to ask a question, Andrew, are you there? This is quite a tricky one about financial incentives, maybe, in order to go green. Andrew? I can't see Andrew. So Andrew is asking, who ought to create the financial incentives or pressures for industries to go green and be more equitable? In particular, he's asking, should that pressure come from consumers, which is an interesting side of how maybe consumers could be a lot more active and activist about, you know, where we buy things from, or should we ask government to do that? Interesting.
I think the answer is that the incentives need to come from everywhere. There are consumers who care very much about, you know, for example, the provenance of food or carbon footprints, and they will make their purchases accordingly. They tend to be more affluent consumers, so you can't rely on consumer pressure. Shareholder pressure is going to be a big one. I think the financial markets really are waking up to some of the risks involved, both environmental, but also reputational and supply chain risks. So that will be a significant source of pressure for anybody who borrows from the bank or goes to the stock market to raise money. But I think there's a role for government as well. Although I think businesses have responsibility here, it can be hard to be the first business to do something without being sure that your competitors are going to do the same thing. And that's where government regulation comes in. It coordinates the changes that businesses need to make and gives them cover to do so, even if there's a short-term hit to profits from it, or you know, they can't be the only one to limit executive pay because nobody else is doing so. So you need all the sectors, all the stakeholders to play a part in this. And so it's what all the social scientists who are listening will know is a wicked problem. It's really hard to get this kind of coordination. And that's one of the focuses of the work that we're doing in the Productivity Institute.
Excellent. Yes, and of course the owners, the ultimate owners of the companies are often, you know, us as pension fund contributors, and you know, but what, you know, capacity do we have to influence as well? Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Fizura, who's Zenova? Are you there? So there's an undergraduate from Toronto, from the other side of the world, is tuned in. So would you like to ask your question? It's about what sectors have the highest capacity to inform change.
Oh,
Are
sure.
you there?
Hi there.
Oh, hi. Yes. Would you like to pose your question?
Yeah, for sure. So I was just wondering, great talk, by the way. Is which of the three kind of main sectors that we were talking about, NGO, private or public, do you think has the highest capacity to inform positive social change in the marketplace? And how can these sectors kind of work more closely to implement these change? I know a lot of them have really like contradictory viewpoints and contradictory interests. So kind of what are your views on that?
It's a very interesting question. When you said sectors, I thought you were going to talk about, manufacturing and services, or the telecoms industry versus other sectors of the economy. But in terms of those different kinds of, stakeholder groups or institutional players, governments are powerful, and they can find people and put them in prison. And so there's clearly a fundamental role for governments to be driving this. And the way that politicians shape public debate is really quite important in affecting what everybody thinks is possible. But I'm not very keen on this sharp distinction that we make between the different sectors, to be honest. We have this quite strong sense that they operate in separate spheres, but they operate in different ways in the same spheres of our life. And the reason I called my book Market, State and People was about exactly the way that all of these different types of institution need to act together to bring about any kind of change. Governments shape markets, but so do the kinds of non-market institutions, whether that's the after-school club or people running food banks. These are all integral parts of our society. And I just don't think it's helpful to have this opposition between the different sectors, as you call them, Firouz, or institutions, and allocate them things to do. Everybody is involved in the whole swathe of things that make up our economic life.
Okay, thank you. I think that what's going to happen is the questions are going to sort of come from all sorts of directions, because it's very difficult for me to try to see, and people are asking lots of different questions. So sorry if it's not as well facilitated as it might be. But Andrew Tim has got a question which is about the people who are extracting too much, perhaps. Andrew, are you around?
Yes, please. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I just read BBC News yesterday. It reported that U.S. super rich pay almost no income tax, and the issue is that the billionaires will pay capital gains, currently 20% in the UK, and the moment he or she sells those shares and release a profit, but unless that is the profit is sunk into another business, which the tax system as it stands is designed to encourage, to promote economic growth and new jobs, jobs that will produce income and therefore tax. So that say its defenders is capitalism at work. But as with the new global consensus on taxing multinationals, the clamor for tax change is getting louder. So my question is, what is your view on this issue? Thanks.
Thanks for the question, which is really quite complicated. No, tax is a complicated business, and economists understand that a tax will affect people's behavior and, in a sense, distort outcomes. So you want to have a system that encourages the kinds of behaviors you like and discourages the kind of behaviors that you don't. And generally encouraging investment is thought to be a good thing. So we have R&D tax credits. But the kind of opinion about tax has clearly shifted a lot over time. In the 1960s, the United States had a top marginal rate of income tax of above 90%. And our view about what's acceptable has shifted dramatically over time. Now, there's some empirical research on this that suggests that about 50% is probably the point beyond which you start losing tax revenues rather than gaining tax revenues from increasing the rate. But we could be taxing much more than we are at the moment. There's an issue about the super rich who feel that they don't owe tax, which I find extraordinary because they live in the same world that we do. Multinationals that feel that they don't have to pay tax. I often look at company reports and see which ones have complex structures of subsidiaries in the British Virgin Islands, and some familiar high street names are among them. It might surprise you to know how much tax avoidance is going on among business. And I find that just deeply irresponsible, because we need taxes to fund public infrastructure, education, the healthcare system, and so on. And the view that we should not be taking more in tax is just distorting what we're able to achieve as a society. So just to give you another example, most people in Britain now have so much invested, both emotionally and financially, in their homes, that they're horrified by the thought of paying capital gains tax on selling their first home. But up until the mid-1960s, we had income tax on the rent that you would have had to pay yourself if you weren't a homeowner, on that imputed rent. And that's now considered completely beyond the pale. So it isn't even what's economically or financially feasible. There's just been such a mood shift in taxation over time. And we want taxes to be efficient, but I think we need to reverse that to some degree, because there's an awful lot of investment we need at the moment in our societies.
Yeah,
Thank you very much. So Ken McPhail, you think there's some handmaidens associating business in killing capitalism or something? Would you like to ask your question, Ken?
Sure, thanks, Bruce, and thank you very much, Diane, for, as usual, a very stimulating talk. I'm just really interested in your views on the fitness for purpose of our current financial reporting system and auditing practices. Do you think that's going to help us address these issues, or does that need to change as well?
Thanks so much for the question, Ken. I'm a little bit uncertain about this. It's not my area. One issue about requiring people to report specific things is that they're going to make sure that they have good numbers. So any system of accounting will have some effect on what people are reporting and therefore what they're going to do. And I'm not sure that you can ever get away from that. I would have a question about auditing of accounts. So given that a kind of inevitable impact of having an accounting system, even if it is more principles and rules based, it seems to me that the auditing system is not working very well. And we've seen a number of really big, notorious cases of that recently. I put out the slide about concentration in different markets. The audit market is one where there's been a lot of concentration, and there's this conflict of interest of consultancy versus audit in the big firms. Seems to me a no-brainer that they should be broken up into those two different branches, but also thinking about injecting some competition into that market. In other contexts, in the digital market, I've been talking about the possibility of a public service competitor introducing a different business model so that you get competition on different aspects of the market. And I just wonder, this is perhaps a flaky idea, but whether a public service auditor set up and publicly funded as a competitor to the big ones would be an interesting experiment.
Thank you. Jonathan, you think that we might be too optimistic about people's changing behavior? Do you want to ask a question?
Yes, well, thank you for the talk, and it's a great topic. And yeah, maybe we're too optimistic. I mean, we're also many academics here, so we're not consultants. We don't have to sell it as if it's all positive, because we also find that it's not always the case. So I've been recently doing research in how the role of consumers in the whole greening of the economy, and especially from people from my network who work in businesses that try to sell green products, they have become quite skeptical, because what they see is, yes, we can introduce kind of a green product line, and so people might buy that, but then it leads to what they call moral self-licensing. So you buy one green product, and that kind of, does it for this week, and everything else can be not sustainable. But hey, I've done my one good deed, so I'm fine. And this is why you see that many businesses even use that to their advantage. They see it as new green niches markets, and they have their niche line to also show, hey, this is what we're doing, but they're not necessarily going for structural change. And I just read this book, I don't know if people can see it, by Michael Mann, The New Climate War, which is very interesting, because he basically even claims that leading people to believe that they're responsible for changing their behavior is exactly what big business wants. Big food, big oil, and so forth, because it means that they don't have to make structural changes themselves. Because then they can say, well, it didn't work. People really weren't changing their behavior. Because they weren't changing their behavior, yeah, the market wasn't really taking off. So we'll just continue business as usual. And he makes very compelling arguments that this has happened in climate change. I've studied it myself for 20 years, and we just seen the same promises again. Here we have Shell again. Oh, they're now going to move faster. Yeah, they said that 20 years ago as well. They haven't. They invested, divested, invested, divested. So are we not too optimistic? Are there not too many of these psychological barriers for people to actually really change? Is it not just time that the government steps in and says, okay, maybe like you can't buy diesel cars or petrol cars, and that's just what we need. Anything else simply won't work. Or am I too pessimistic?
Mm-hmm. Well, I personally, it's a great question. I veer between optimism and pessimism about prospects for change. And I do agree with you that this is not an individual challenge. Individuals are not going to solve coordination problems by themselves. And governments have to step in. I was really struck a few years ago when a friend of mine was running a campaign called Close the Door, and it was trying to get shops not to leave their doors open during the winter, blasting heat out into the streets. And the reason they do that is that they want to get the impulse buyers. This was, of course, in the days when we could all go to shops and, go in without queuing up and so on. They wanted the impulse purchasers. And if they closed their door, the shoppers who were going to do the impulse buys would go to the next store along. So it was a classic coordination problem. And I took my friend along to meet a contact at whatever the BEIS, the Business and Enterprise Department was called in those days. And the official listened politely and said, well, no, there's nothing for us to do here because the businesses would save money. And, the incentive for them to reduce their heating bills is just enough for them to get them to change their behavior, which is, of course, completely wrong because we're talking about coordinating lots of different people's behaviors. So I agree with you about consumers, and consumer pressure, to the extent it does anything, is helpful. But I think the real changes will be, one is government deciding to regulate certain things, what kind of cars we drive, what kind of electricity generation we have. But the other is actually the financial markets and the realization that climate risks in particular, but also supply chain risks, are becoming real hits to companies' bottom lines and stock market valuations. Reputational hits can destroy the value of the company almost overnight because it's what 80% of stock market value now is intangible capital of different kinds. So I think those two will be much more effective. And then we will all fall in line, but it's the responsibility is not for each individual, it's a system problem.
Thank you. Jules Lowe has an interesting question about the extent to which government actions need to be long-term and coordinated. Are you with us? Sorry, I can't speak. Hello, Jules. Yes.
I might have to move because there's a feedback issue.
Okay. Are you able to ask a question?
Hopefully you can still hear me there. Diane, thank you. And I am similarly incensed by open shop doors on cold days. It makes me angry. I have some sympathy with Bruce's view over the fact that the inevitability of a rise in living standards might be a fallacy. However, if we did accept your view that there are plenty of innovations out there that will enable a continued rise in living standards and a greener agenda as a spin-off as we go along, how will this happen without clear, direct, long-term strategy from the government? And does that strategy need to be aligned globally? And the reason I say this is, in my own particular sector, we have a planning timeline ahead of about 5 years at best in some areas. And I feel that actually other nations are looking 20 to 30 years ahead in this area.
Yes, it's a great question, Jules. I completely agree with you. And I was a bit disheartened when in the last budget, the government abolished the industrial strategy and replaced it with a plan for growth. I don't really mind what they call it, but it's the fact that it keeps changing. And there are just key areas of policy where there has been a much much more of a policy seesaw in the UK compared to other countries. So whether it's energy markets and how they operate, or further education policy, I'm looking at areas now, spending on prisons and homelessness and special educational needs. And in any area that you look at in depth, there's just been a quite extraordinary series of different policy changes. And so, you know, people say business is short term, but political decision making appears to be the next day's headlines or the next tweet. And it's really unsatisfactory. I think it's possible that some of my colleagues in the Productivity Institute will look at this and the extent to which the kinds of institutions, the decision-making institutions we have in the UK, contribute to those policy switches. But if you're building any kind of long-lived asset, then these policy time horizons are absolutely hopeless. So I've got complete sympathy with you, and I would hope that if the government's serious about levelling up and increasing productivity, that we can get some kind of consensus across the parties about the need for, at least in some areas, a more strategic view of what we need.
Yes, well, I totally agree with this lack of long-termism. I actually was originally an economic geographer in Newcastle in the mid-80s. That's where I was an undergraduate, and of course the north-south divide was really drummed home to us then, and you know, very little happened, very little change, and you know, how long will levelling up last? I mean, will it last beyond Boris as his PMship? You know, this becomes a slogan, doesn't it? It's quite depressing in this country how short-term things are. On a different tone, but Graham Winch has an interesting question about what we should measure and what should be included. So Graham, do you want to ask a question?
Oh, yeah, and yes, I share your optimism about quite radical innovations that are going to come along technologically. But my question is, will they actually increase productivity in the same way as the 20th century innovations did? So if you think about health technologies, you think about green technologies, they're going to bring us enormous benefits, but they're unlikely to quite possibly raise productivity in the old-fashioned way. So my question was really, should we actually starting to redefine income, or indeed wages, to include those greater quality of life benefits from less pollution, more active lifestyle, ability to live longer, and so on and so forth. I mean, so I'm going right back to, you know, that graph you had right at the start, which actually real wages, perhaps conventionally defined, they will stay level, but we'll be getting other social and welfare benefits. And perhaps we need to create the narrative that convinces people, yes, you are better off because you're not breathing dirty air anymore. Don't know, just a thought.
Yeah, well, I share your thoughts about that, Graham. I completely agree that we might need to reconceptualize how we think about productivity and improvements, and it's going to vary quite a lot depending on what you're talking about. But an area that you and I once discussed when I was in Manchester was about productivity in construction. And the digitalization that's going on there includes measures that will reduce running costs in the future because the sensors are being put into the structures. And that's going to reduce expenditures and measured GDP unless you somehow take account of the benefits and time saving that are going to be created by that. And similarly, as you're saying, with saving CO2 emissions with clean energy or improving quality of life with medical technologies, that's not going to show up in our usual measures of revenue divided by the inputs that we account for. I'm quite interested in thinking about time, and there are things where if they happen quicker, that's an improvement in productivity in some sense. And then there are other areas where you want to have more time, but it's high quality time involved. So the quality matters more. So the example I often give is a nurse taking a blood test. You want it to be really swift and painless versus an ICU nurse where you want that one person's sustained quality attention over time. So I'm interested in that. I'm interested in measuring well-being, and I think the conceptual framework for how we think about progress will, at some time in the future, be very different from the one that we have now.
Thank you. And I think sort of possibly extending the theme on well-being and what we can learn from experiments. Hong Wei Hee, are you with us? Have you got a question about what we can learn from the pandemic experience and how we might benefit from this experiment? Would you like to ask a question?
Yes. Oh, good evening. Yeah, thanks, Diane. Very interesting, stimulating talk. My question is quite simple. Probably, actually, a lot of people are asking. I mean, we have different opinions probably on how this pandemic has been handled, whether it's think positively or negatively. But I think that probably there's some lessons that we can learn from it, because I mean, there's some resemblance here, because it's both of these issues are at a global scale. Oh, sorry, excuse me. My kids just opened it. Sorry. Yeah, it's at a global scale, and then it requires global effort and coordination and collaboration and so on. So I just wonder, what do you think, what kind of lessons or experience that we have gained over the last year or so, and in terms of how we can tackle this even bigger, longer term issue of climate change? So thank you.
Well, thank you for the question, which is not a straightforward one to answer. And, there's a sense in which we're not going to know what we've learned until long after this has passed. I have been thinking about taking seriously the impact of what's happened over the past 15 to 18 months. It has been just an extraordinary shock to the economy, but also to people's lives and well-being. So I don't think we begin to know yet what the impact of that hit to people's well-being has been, and how it will shake up everybody's views about what's needed, what needs to change. But I don't think I can answer your question in any very full way, but let me just give one example from a piece of work I've recently finished. And that's we were looking at the value that people state they get from free digital goods, because there's a debate in economic statistics about how you measure that and should it be fitted into GDP in some way. And we did some very large scale surveys with YouGov, asking people to say what amount of money they would need to do without different free digital goods for 1 month or 12 months. And we ran it at the end of February, beginning of March 2020. And then the pandemic hit. And so we repeated the waves in May 2020 and February 2021. And luckily we had included some non-digital goods to compare those, and some free non-digital goods, particularly parks, access to a park. Just because we were testing, is it the freeness that makes the difference to what people say, or are they comparing these free goods in some way to market competitors? And there were some really big changes in valuation, stated values, as you'd expect. And the stated value of internet search and personal email, online shopping, they went up, but also the value of access to a public park by a very large amount. And that's just one example of how big the relative changes in what we think is important might be coming out of the pandemic. And my sense is that there'll be some quite big societal changes, and this is a great time to be a social scientist and a researcher, because these are exactly the kind of questions that we want to answer.
Thank you. On a related note, Tim Hain, are you with us? Tim, you're asking whether you think the EU and other governments are on the right track with their response, the green and just. Are you with us, Tim?
Yes, hi, I'm with you. Thank you, Bruce, and thank you, Diane, for the excellent presentation. Yeah, Bruce, I think you already summarized my question. If you could just, Professor Coyle, rate the government's response, where it has been framed so many times as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to course correct, but how would you see the measures that now have been taken in terms of a just and green recovery that has been named many times? Thank you so much.
Thank you for the question. It's quite hard to generalize about different governments because it's obviously varied a lot around the world. And I'm just very glad I was not in any public service role when the pandemic hit. I have every sympathy for the politicians and civil servants who found themselves dealing with this unprecedented event. And obviously, we all think some of them did better than others. People pick out New Zealand and Jacinda Ardern, and I think for very good reason. And but perhaps it's easier in a smaller economy where the people who need to coordinate are much more likely to know each other than in a big country like any of the major EU countries or the UK. So having said that and expressed that sympathy, I suppose it would be really nice to see some global leadership. People have drawn the comparison with World War II, and there were some real visionaries who came out of that shocking experience, whether it was Winston Churchill here in the UK or Clement Attlee in the Labour government with a radical transforming vision, implementing the Beveridge Report and introducing the National Health Service, whether it was the pioneers of the forerunner to the European Union and the vision they had for unity in a continent that had just, where countries had been slaughtering each other's people. So I don't see that kind of vision, I have to say, at the moment. And in my pessimistic moods, that's what I worry about as we look forward, because it does need that kind of leadership to tackle these wicked problems. So if Joe Biden is listening in his spare time from the G7 summit, please take note.
Yeah. Actually, yesterday at the Productivity Institute conference, there was a presentation by Jonathan Pinsky and some colleagues, which were about their different responses to the crisis. It was, I think it was France and Germany, and I'm not sure about UK. My headline recollection is they basically looked after their vested interests. So Germany looked after the car industry, for example. So it's a sad thing about perhaps not being so forward-looking. If I got that wrong, Jonathan, you can come back if you like.
I think that's correct, more or less, yes. Path dependencies played a very big role.
As a first approximation. Okay, good, thank you. I think we might be out of questions, but I'm going to abuse my privilege once more. So I was kind of thinking about what might be, and one thing that I thought was quite interesting would be, what about if we had more? So one thing that we have is employee-owned companies. And what's quite striking is how few there are. I did some the Google search earlier, and it seems that they are expanding, but from an extremely low base. Of course, we know most famous employee-owned company is John Lewis, which apparently has 83,000 partners or employees. But beyond that, there's apparently only 430 or so in the whole country, which seems an amazingly tiny number, of which there's about 5 with 10,000 or more employees, such as Mott MacDonald and Arabs. But I was kind of wondering about these alternative structures, and if we want sort of the ownership, if people can produce, own also what they produce as owners, then isn't that something we could encourage? And why have we got so few of them?
It's an interesting question. One of the things the literature said about employee ownership the last time that they were quite fashionable, which I think was in the 1990s, was that it was actually not a sensible thing for individuals to have all their eggs in one basket. And so there were problems about employee ownership. But having said that, I don't know whether it's the case that we're unusual here in not having so many and other countries have more. It always seems to me that it's not very healthy to have all companies operating in exactly the same way. So some diversity of business models and corporate structures would be good, but I don't know how you make that work with a particular legal framework for corporate governance. I'm quite encouraged by the number of non-profit companies, B Corp type companies that are being created now. So perhaps that's a way of injecting some variety into the system.
Yes. I'm totally in favor of variety as well. I was just struck by how few there are, remarkably. There are a few more in professional services, which is a sector I take interest in, but yeah. Okay, thank you. There's a couple more questions. Jovanik, Mendis, you're asking about what the economics profession might learn from the pandemic, I think. Are you with us?
Hi, yes. Hi, Professor Coyle. So the question that I wanted to ask was, in what way do you think economics as a profession could improve in a post-pandemic world? And to what extent do you feel that economics has actually failed us in the ways in which we could have actually prepared for a pandemic, given its importance of the role of advising a government, even though it's only on an advisory capacity? Thank you.
Thanks for the question, Javinka. So I think to give you a full answer to this question, I'm going to have to ask you to buy my next book, which is all about the role of economists and economics as a profession. I suppose I'm a big fan of economics. I think we have a very powerful way of analysing what's happening and providing evidence that can inform governments. My biggest concern about economics is that it's got too narrow in many ways. One is in the kinds of method and the way it frames questions. So I would like to see a much wider range of methods used in economics and much more openness to other social sciences and to history and management studies. The other narrowness is the lack of diversity within economics itself. It's a middle class white male profession to a much greater degree than most other academic disciplines. And we're supposed to be a social science. You're not going to ask the right questions about society if you're so unrepresentative of your society. You don't know what you don't know. And so I think that needs tackling too. But I've just written a blog post today saying, why isn't there a government chief anthropologist? I think we ought to promote some of the other social sciences too.
Excellent, thank you. So we've got two more questions. The first one is from Claire Marie, and then I'll leave the last question to someone I think might even know Grigor McClelland, which is John Pantel, before handing back to Fiona. So Claire Marie, would you like to ask your questions about leadership?
Cheers, Bruce, thanks, yes. Hi, Diane, thanks very much. You've given us loads of food for thought. I mean, I've been really surprised at how agile we are as a species and how adaptable we are. And the pandemic has felt a bit like a practice run. Like we've proved to ourselves that if we really want to change, we can. To your point about leadership and the lack of genuine, worthwhile leadership at the moment, you know, what are your thoughts around, you've mentioned diversity there, what are your thoughts around what needs to be done to change the leadership styles, capabilities, vision, strategic thinking, and is there anything practical you can think of that, you know, as a business school we can do, but also on a global stage, what needs to happen?
I'm not sure I've got an easy answer for you, Claire Marie. You know, to pick up from my last response, I think diversity is important because it's diversity of backgrounds that gives you different leadership styles and brings different ideas to the table. I suppose, I mean, you've got quite an optimistic take on what we've achieved over this extraordinary disruption, which I like. So I suppose another thing that is optimistic is the way that there has been kind of self-organization in some areas. The way that young people have organized themselves in terms of the climate strikes and climate action, I think is just incredibly encouraging. And it may be that thinking about young leadership, thinking about leadership for people who are running campaigns would be one practical way that people in business schools can contribute.
Thank you very much. And our last question was from John Pantal, who observed that Grigor McClelland used to cycle in from West Didsbury to MBS, which is something I also enjoy doing when I'm allowed to. But so, John, would you like to ask a question?
Thanks, Chair. Thank you, Diane. Just one comment and a quick question. I'm involved still with local government pension funds, so ESG is very much to the fore. I would very much agree that we've got to work at not only the individual company level, but also the national level and the individual behaviour level. And I think if Grigor had been alive, he would be embarrassed by the fact that in Greater Manchester, we still have 200,000 sorry, 200 million annual short car journeys of less than a kilometre. He would have been really addressing that. But when I joined the business school in 1967 from Economic and Social Studies, I was working with the NHS, and Grigor was very committed even then. And my question is that low productivity in the NHS has been a major concern. And now, as you know from the backlog figures of operations, the 5 million, we've got to really address that. We're not doing it. And you pointed out about the innovations, you know, at the beginning of your lecture. The problem is a lot of the innovations aren't getting through into the NHS. And I quoted a previous lecturer in one of the series from AMBS, Professor Hidalgo, on how humans judge machines. How do we actually get over the messages about innovation and new technology in the NHS, and how do we improve productivity? Otherwise, we'll have a disaster. Thank you.
Thanks for the question, John. It's a great question. And actually, I can tell you about a piece of work I did for the Productivity Institute as a working paper looking at productivity in the NHS during the pandemic. And one of the things we did was interview senior leaders in Manchester and in Cambridge, in two very big hospital trusts. And the events had made them adopt new technology in new ways. So we got a lot of comments from people saying, we have changed our use of technology faster than I'd have thought possible. It would have taken years if this hadn't happened. And that was both how they used it to organize themselves internally, including the ways they use patient records and hold meetings and so on, but also patient consultations. So it's possible that we will see more take-up of technology in the health service. I've got a couple of questions I'd want to ask about it. One is about distributional effects. A lot of remote healthcare will depend on people at home having access to things like smartphones or pulse oximeters. Even if it's only £20, it's too much money for a lot of people. So somebody's got to pay for all of that. And the other is just evaluating patient outcomes through remote consultations. And we don't know yet whether it makes them better or worse, and that will take a bit of time. The other issue, of course, is that we as a nation are very committed to a public service NHS free at the point of use. And there's just a distrust that the government is going to privatise through contracting to different technology companies. And I would like us to have a clearer debate about that. The NHS buys in all kinds of services that don't bother us, you know, payroll services, even cleaning services, which I think they would do better to keep in-house. But there's a sort of border there, and we're not very clear about where the border is between what's acceptable to buy in from a private company, and does that include the tech or not? And I think that's going to be quite a difficult debate. It's a really important question.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I think I'm going to have to close the Q&A now. I apologize to anyone who asked a question which I didn't notice and didn't put to Diane, so I'm sorry about that. My incompetence on my part entirely. So I'd like to thank Diane for answering an amazing range of questions. It's incredible to take the bowling from all sides, as it were, and I'd like to thank the audience for asking the questions. So it just remains for me to hand back to Fiona Devine, the Director of the Business School, to give some closing remarks. Thank you very much. Over to you, Fiona.
Thank you, Bruce, and thank you very much for facilitating this discussion here today. Just to pick up on one point that was made just a moment ago by Claire Marie, I do hope that as a business school, that we're really engaging with these debates and big questions. And I know that many of our academics, if not all of our academics, are really including and embedding all of these issues in the curriculum. And it may be that we are shaping the next generation and the next generation of leaders that will contribute to some of the important changes that are happening. Even though, like you and many people, I oscillate between optimism and pessimism, but try to hold out on the optimism side for the sake of the next generation, of course. So just to thank you again, Diane. Absolutely fantastic talk. You've really stimulated us all, as we've heard from all the questions. Very appreciative of how you've taken account of what this annual lecture is about, with regard to Grigor McClelland and what the business school is about, and the university, and how we take many issues, these big, great societal challenges, wicked problems, social responsibility. We're deeply committed to them and attach huge importance to them in all that we do in terms of our research and teaching. So just like to take this opportunity to thank you again. It's been a great honour to host you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and I hope to be in Manchester before too long.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yes. Yes.
Thank you, everybody. And good night.
Good night, all.
Thank you very much. Thank you all.